well, as many people have different experiences with the church. It's at times quite confusing as people use the word church different ways and in different meanings. And if we think that's new, it's interesting that J.C. Ryle, a pastor writing 150 years ago in England, said, "Few words are so misunderstood as the word church. Few mistakes have so much injured the cause of pure religion. Ignorance on this point has been a fertile source of bigotry, sectarianism, and persecution." And so if we think there's been challenges about the church and that's new, just have to look back in history. It's a controversial thing, but it's quite an important thing, isn't it? Something we need to say something about. And Jesus, even at the pivot of his ministry, talks about the church and brings it up. So it's something important, and it's really a large topic. I was a bit ambitious as I selected this text and I was preparing. There's more that can be said than we're going to even say in this passage alone. We're going to have to leave some parts of it just away from it just because we can't do it all. But it's something important that we need to think about, we need to understand. And we're going to focus really on trying to define what the church is. What is it? And then understanding the members of that church. Who is part of it? So what is the church and who is part of the church? And as we do that, we jump in first, finding the location of this story is important. We were right, Jesus comes to the region of Caesarea Philippi. It's 25 miles north of the Sea of Galilee on the foothills of Mount Hermon. It's way up at the very top. It's a secluded area. He pulls his disciples away and he goes to the retreat center and he's going to ask them important questions to reflect on the big issues. That's really what's going on. And so as they reflect in this area, Jesus asks the big question. Well, first he warms up and says, who do people say that in? What's going on in social media with me? What are they saying? That's really what his question is. And they give all these different answers, right? Like, Elijah is one of them, or first John the Baptist, right? He's the most recent prophet who died. Or maybe Elijah, he's the great Old Testament prophet. Or maybe Jeremiah, the prophet of doom. We could say a lot about that, but we won't. It's interesting that they think he might be Jeremiah, or he's some other prophet. But either way, he's a prophet, which means the people think he's a spokesman for God. And then Jesus asks the second big question. Okay, but who do y'all say I am? Like, you guys are here. Who do you say that I am? And Peter, probably as the representative of the entire group, he answers, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. That first idea, the Christ, or the Messiah, the anointed one. This is a Jewish Old Testament concept of the person who's going to be the figure of fulfillment, the person who's going to complete everything that's been promised and bring in the kingdom of God. That person who's going to be the expectation of all of the Old Testament scriptures. And then he adds on top of that the Son of God, which is maybe a reference to Jesus' divinity, but at least it's a very unique, special relationship to God if you're the Son of God. And so the main idea is this is Jewish language for a person who's going to restore the kingdom of God to Israel. That's his answer. And how does Jesus respond to that? How does Jesus feel about this? He gives kind of two things. In verse 17, we see he explains the source of this answer. Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. In other words, only God, by opening your eyes, was able to make you say this, see this, believe this, and be able to utter this. The source is that this is not earthly understanding. This is the divine wisdom that comes down. But then he renames Peter, right? He renames the Peter. He says, I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. It's a big statement there. First, it's a renaming. Now, this doesn't really sound like a renaming because we call him Peter all the time. But Peter is just the word for rock or stone. It's not a name in the first century until after this. No one's ever named Peter. It's kind of like being named Bedrock. You don't know a friend named Bedrock. You just don't. It's not a word. It's just, you are rock. He's renaming him rock. He's really Simon Peter. And so he renames him. And then he says, on this rock I'm going to build my church. Why does he rename him? And rock that he's going to build his church on? Now, if you've never asked that question, there's books written on that question. A lot of people discuss it, so we're not going to answer all of them, but I'll give you 4 options briefly. One of the possibilities is that Jesus is building his church on Peter, that this rock is the disciple himself. That's option 1. Second option is that Jesus is building his church on the apostles, that Peter is that representative of the 12 apostles. We see in Ephesians 3 the church is built on the apostles and prophets, so that's the idea. Or that Jesus is building his church on faith, that this fact that God revealed this to him is what he's building the church on, this revelation of revealing it. Or the fourth option, the last one, is that this is the confession itself, the statement, you are the Christ. And so that Jesus is going to build his church on that confessional statement that he's the Christ. Those are kind of the possibilities out there. And there's a lot of discussion about it. I'll give you, I think the best way to approach it, there's an ambiguity, but I pull from the argument of silence. Now, arguments of silence are really, if you're in logic class, are not the strongest arguments, but there's not a lot of overly compelling reasons. I think the arguments from silence goes like this. If Jesus wanted to refer to Peter's person himself, it seems odd that he would not put a you in there. On this, you are Peter, and on you I will build my church. That would seem the natural flow if he's talking to Peter. But then he inserts this on this, as if it's something beyond Peter. That this implies it's a referent beyond Peter, but not totally beyond him. It's something close by. And somehow it's connected to him because he uses the word rock again. And from that argument from silence, it makes option 3, faith, and option 4, confession, make much more sense. It's something beyond Peter himself. And really, the last option I find the most compelling, that this is the confession. On this rock. What's the rock? Well, the whole passage is about the questions Jesus has been leading to. Who am I? Who do people say I am? Who do you say? That's been the flow. So the pivotal idea is, you are the Christ, the Son of God. And then he concludes, yep, you're the first person who said it. You are rock. And on the rock of this confession, I'm going to build my church. What does this have to do with the church? Well, it gives us our first point about the church. That the church is founded on Jesus of Nazareth being the Old Testament Messiah. That Jesus is the Christ, that person of fulfillment. And anything that's not centered upon Christ, or Jesus as the Christ, is not really the church. It might be a very morally good, it might be a communally run and biblically true thing, but if it's not centered and grounded upon Jesus being the Messiah, the Old Testament fulfillment, it's not really and truly the church. Just like a body without a soul is not quite totally the person there. An institution or a thing, a church that doesn't actually have the confession, Jesus is the Christ, it's not really it. And so we see the first thing is it's founded upon this confession. And there's 3 more things I'll give you very quickly and very simply. They come from that very simple statement. The second thing is, who's the owner of this church? Jesus. On my church. Jesus personally commands the church. You see in other scripture, he's the head of the church. It's his church. So it's founded on the confession of Christ, and it's his personal church. It's not someone else's church. Sometimes pastors say things like, well, my church is doing well and my church is not doing well. We don't have to, you don't have to correct them the next time they make that mistake. But really, that's wrong. I've done it too. But that's not really the way we should think about it. It's Christ's church, on my church. And then thirdly about this church, it is built by who? Jesus. I will build my church. Jesus establishes the church. Jesus is constructing the church. Some people sometimes consider the church a later addition. Jesus' living movement got stodgy and sterilized and institutionalized. That picture can come away. But if we see it right here, according to Jesus' own words, it's his vision, it's his construction project, and he's building it. So if we want to affirm Jesus' words, we have to affirm what he says. It's my church and I'm building it. So, seeing this, we've seen it's founded on the confession. owned by Jesus, my church. It's built by Jesus. And lastly, you might say, well, what really is the church? What's the essence of it? What's the core of it? Well, when we use the word church, and we hear it here, I will build my church. We think of the word church, we think of a building, right? That's how we use the word. Or a nebulous group of Christians out there. Those are kind of our definitions of the word church, which really has nothing to do with the word that's here. The word it's one of those like 3 or 4 Greek words you've heard. You've heard, agape, and you've heard koinonia, and you've heard ecclesia. It's the word ecclesia, which doesn't mean much to us, but we want to get back to what the idea is. An ecclesia is an assembling of called out people. An assembling of called out people. And it's actually referencing the Old Testament word where that was used, kahal, of a gathering and assembling the people of God. The quintessential example of that is Mount Sinai, where they're sitting below Mount Sinai. They don't know what they're doing there. And then Moses comes down and says, "Now, it's going to be time tomorrow. You're going to assemble." And they assemble before the Lord. They purify themselves, and then they assemble, and Moses comes down and he brings the word. And they read it, and then they affirm it, and then they worship and sacrifice. That's the assembly. That's the word he's getting at. And so when we think of church, it's God's people assembled before him. God's people assembled before him. A set-aside people meeting together before their God. That's really what the essence of it is. That's really the root of it, as it were. And we want to keep that in mind. We have so many other conceptions of the church. We can't respond to every single one now, but that's really the root of the idea there. And when we bring our other conceptions, that might be a challenge we have to deal with, but it's not really what Jesus is talking about when he's saying, "I'm building my church." So we define what the church is. It's this assembly of called out people before God who listen to him and worship him. It's the gathering that is owned by Jesus, right? And it's a gathering that is centered upon Jesus being the Christ, and it's a gathering that's created by Jesus. I will build it. And then the question is, well, who's part of it? Who is part of this group? And the answer comes very simply: those who affirm that Jesus is the Christ, right? The confessional statement is the center of this passage. That's who it is. But what does it mean that Jesus is the Christ, right? The Messiah? What does that mean? Well, Jesus actually explains it right after this, doesn't he? In verse 21, he starts to explain he's going to go to Jerusalem. He must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things, and he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life. Notice twice in there, must. If there's a necessary suffering, a death, and then a resurrection. That's what the Christ is. Anyone who wishes to be part of the church is going to affirm and must affirm that Jesus is the one who died and the one who was raised. That's his identity. If we don't affirm that, we're not part of Jesus' church as Jesus defines it. It's the center right there. Now that's sometimes hard to accept. People don't always like to accept that. Peter didn't like to accept it, right? You see what Peter does right after this? How does he respond when Jesus teaches him? "Oh, yes. I'm sitting at your feet, Jesus?" No, he says, "Jesus, let me take you aside and kind of straighten you out. The Messiah is not going to do that. And you're never going to do that." Just remember that. You can hear the boldness of Peter there. I'm really excited to meet Peter if I know what he's like. Because that's a bold statement to come alongside Jesus and rebuke him. And then Jesus doesn't, gentle Jesus, not meek and mild, right? He says, "No, get out of my way, Satan. You're a stumbling block to God's plan." In other words, to align yourself with Jesus and his suffering, the Christ who suffers, is to align yourself with God's plan. And to oppose that Christ is to align yourself with Satan and spiritual forces. It's very interesting. It's a very black and white picture, isn't it? Jesus says there's those who are with me and they're my allies, and there are those who oppose me and they're Satan's allies. That's really what he's setting up here. It's very black and white. It shows us the seriousness of affirming whether Jesus is the Christ or not. It's not a little thing when Jesus pulls out some big rebukes for it. And we have to also realize it's a very spiritual mission that Jesus, when he's rebuked, puts it in spiritual categories. There's God's side and there's Satan's side. Whose side are you on? And we have to realize that's a little bit surprising. For Peter, and for most of the Jews of the day, the Messiah, he was going to be a national leader. He was going to restore the glory days of Israel. He was going to remove the Roman occupation, which was oppressing the economy and the people there. That's what he was going to do. And Jesus, as he defines the Messiah, is one who's going to restore Israel not by fighting Roman occupation or any earthly power, but by fighting sin, by destroying spiritual forces. And so the Jewish Messiah is one who was going to fix surface issues. And Christ says, no, I didn't come to fix the surface issues. I came to take out the root, sin, and your bondage and slavery to the spiritual kingdom. And so if you want to be against me as the Messiah, you're going to be embracing Satan. But if you're going to be with me, he's going to be opposing Satan, Christ. And that's something really important, that the offer of the gospel that the church has as we offer Christ, it's not a surface issue. It's a dealing with the root of the problem. It's a liberation from the dominion of sin, from selfishness, and the addictions that go along with selfishness, and all the moral filth that can come out of a heart that is bent inward and is curved inward. And Jesus says, the church is going to be opposed to that, because I'm going to be opposing Satan. And so if we understand the Christ well, we see he's someone who's going to suffer and die and be raised. We affirm that. He's someone who's going to oppose Satan. He's coming for a spiritual issue. And there's one other little thing that is put on the end there. You notice in verse 27, he's going to return, right? Interestingly, there's the assumption there that he did actually bodily raise. If he's returning, he's not dead. He came back, and now he's returning. And what is he going to do? He's going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and he will reward each person according to what he's done. In other words, there will be a judgment. There will be an army of angels behind Jesus, and he's going to sift the people. And there will be reward, salvation offered. That is Christ. And as an assembly of called out ones, the church, we're looking forward to that. There's a great forward gaze in the church that's longing and looking for when Christ will return. It's not just the group that's turned inward, we're looking forward. You might say, well, is that all we do? Do we just look forward and just hope and pray and cross our fingers it's going to happen one day? Well, that's not what Jesus says. He also tells us that we're going to follow him. If you want to be part of that church, you're going to deny yourself. You're going to repudiate your self-identity. You're going to take up your cross. You're going to kill your self-identity. You're going to follow me. You're going to pursue Christ. See, that's a big thing. But notice the reason he gives right after that, verse 25. Whoever wants to save his life will lose it. Whoever wants to lose his life for me will find it. Clinging to this life is folly. It's like holding sand. It's going to fall right through your fingers. But if you want to sacrifice your life to me, then you're going to have life. That's the reason. You say, oh, okay, so it's better. It's going to work out. But do that soon, not today. But notice what Jesus says right on top of that. He shows us the weightiness of it. What good is it if you gain the whole world but forfeit your soul? He just presses that upon us and says, your spiritual well-being must take precedence over everything else. And that's Jesus calling us to his church. That's how he thinks of it. And so we've seen that Jesus admits he's the Christ. He explains the Christ's mission. He announces his plan to build this church. He rebukes people who have a faulty view of him. And now he teaches us to walk after him, to follow that road of self-denial, dropping everything else, because that's going to be the fullness of life if you sacrifice to him. And your soul is so permanent and so important, it's greater than the whole world. the Jesus of his church that we need to seek and find. And if you haven't met that Jesus, by all means, take up your cross and follow him, and he will meet you and he will find you. But if you have met that Jesus, is there anything else we need to know? Well, there's a great comfort in being part of this church. I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. And if you are part of this church, for those who are in this church, who are part of Christ's community, hell itself cannot stop Jesus. That's the picture. The death's grip, the gates of Hades that might keep you enchained, death itself, no, Jesus is going to pry that back. That Hades will not be able to hold you. That's how powerful Christ is. That's how much he has conquered death. And we're to take great comfort in that. When we think of the church, when we just think of frustrating things or things of this world, we're supposed to remember, no, Jesus said, I'm going to defeat death. That's the people who I'm going to take out of death, and Hades cannot hold them. And all we can do is say, praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us in the heavenly realms with every spiritual blessing in Christ. Or as 1 Peter says, we have been given a new hope, a new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's our living hope through the resurrection of Christ. So take comfort, Christian, in this church that God is building, that Christ is setting up. It's a great place of safety from the greatest enemy. Let's go before me in prayer. Lord, you are good and kind, and you have given us comfort, and you have conquered death. We don't know and understand all of your words all the time. There's much that you have taught us that we do not always believe, but help us to understand the great joy there is in taking up our cross and following you, being part of that group that assembles in worship before you. I pray that we would learn to love you, we learn to love your church, and that we would learn to have a great assurance before death. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. I'm going to stand in that general area. So we're going to ask Rob some questions. And let me, before I ask you these questions, let me peel back the curtain a little bit and explain kind of how Rob got here. So when we ask these questions, we is a representation of the Presbytery of Western Carolina. And so there's a handful of ruling elders and teaching elders in the room. And we represent the Presbytery this afternoon. And so these questions are coming from us. And so Rob has gone through a process, which I believe began like about a year ago, maybe last spring. Is that correct? Like RUF assessment?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's gone through a process. He has told his story. He has preached sermons on video. Countless people have listened to sermons that he's preached in the past. He's come before the Presbytery. He's met with a committee of the Presbytery who's asked him questions, vetted him, like, you know, who are you? And show us your heart for the Lord. Show us your call. And then he went, on top of all that stuff, he was examined, like a paper exam. It's called a transfer exam because he's already been ordained. And so then another committee sat with those papers of his answers to make sure he wasn't a crazy, theologically heretic guy. And they were like, these answers are good. And then after that, he went to the floor of the Presbytery, which is, by the way, if you've never been to a Presbytery meeting, they're a lot of fun. On a Saturday, typically, or Tuesday. And then there he stood before a room full of pastors and elders and answered more theological questions. All I'm saying is, he didn't just fill out an application online and he's here. Okay, so like he went through this process to get to where he is now. And it's a mystery. How Jesus calls a person and sends them to a place, it's mysterious, but we really believe that Jesus has brought you here. And so, with all that, I'm going to ask you these questions, okay? This might be a good time, if you're a family or friends, this would be a good time to take pictures. This is a neat moment, because these questions, as I read them, you will begin to feel the weight of them for him. Okay? So step in a little bit. And so here they are. Okay? Are you now willing to take charge of this congregation as their pastor, agreeable to your declaration and accepting its call? I am. Do you constantly, this is a hard word for me to say. Someone say this word for me. Thank you. Do you, that word, believe and declare, as far as you know, your own heart, that in taking upon you this charge, you are influenced by a sincere desire to promote the glory of God and the good of the church? Do you solemnly promise that by the assistance of the grace of God, you will endeavor faithfully to discharge all the duties of a pastor to this congregation, and will you be careful to maintain a deportment in all respects, becoming a minister of the gospel of Christ, agreeable to your ordination engagements?
I do.
Did you feel like, especially that third one, I would love to know who actually wrote that particular question, but did you feel the weight of what he's agreeing to do? It's weighty. And I know other people are going to say things to you, but you do not carry that weight. Okay? Just want you to know that. So now I have questions for you guys, the congregation. And specifically, this is questions for the students who are here. Because Rob is being called to be your pastor. And so these questions are for you. Okay? And for everybody who's here. Do you, the people of this congregation, continue to profess your readiness to receive Rob Herron, whom you have called to be your pastor?
We do.
Do you promise to receive the word of truth from his mouth with meekness and love, and to submit to him in the due exercise of discipline?
We do.
Do you promise to encourage him in his labors and to assist his endeavors for your instruction in spiritual edification?
We do.
And do you engage to continue to him, while he is your pastor, that competent worldly maintenance which you have promised, and to furnish him with whatever you may see needful for the honor of religion and for his comfort among you?
We do.
You know what you just agreed to? That last one? That's like, you're agreeing to feed him, to clothe him, to love his wife and his son. You're agreeing to support him by whatever means the Lord is calling you to do that. Okay? Okay, so now, Rob, stay here. So now, any teaching elder or ruling elder who is in the room can come up and extend, this is called the right hand of fellowship. And so, you guys come on up, give him the right hand of fellowship. Give him a big hug. And guys, stay up here. When you come up, stay up. Gentlemen, will you lay hands on this young man? Can I call you Western Carolina Presbytery, I declare that Reverend Robert Johnson Herron has been elected and installed as the RUF campus minister at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina. Congratulations. You guys can all go sit back down. And then Rob, you stay up here. So what we're about to do next is a pretty cool thing, because what our BCO, that's a book of church order, what our BCO encourages us to do when these kind of occasions happen is to encourage him and to encourage you. Okay? So I'm going to ask Will to come up. Will is the RUF pastor at ETSU, just across the way. And so he has some words for Rob specifically.
Great, thanks. Y'all can turn to Luke 10 if you want to follow along with me, or swipe there, or just listen. But Rob, I'm so excited to be here. I grew up in Boone, so this is really fun to be back here. My house is like a stone's throw behind here, so just so excited to see not just what God is going to do through you, but I really want to focus right now on what God has done in you. So let's read Luke 10, verses 17 through 20. The 72 returned with joy, saying, "Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name." And he said to them, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Behold, I have given you authority to tread on serpents and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall hurt you. Nevertheless, do not rejoice in this, that the spirits are subject to you, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven." This is God's word. Let's pray. God, I pray that this whole day would be just a day of sweet encouragement to Rob, and in moments where he feels discouraged in ministry or in life, that he would look back and remember how you have called him here, Jesus. In Christ's name. Amen. So, Rob, I know you're a college football fan, University of Tennessee, and so I don't know if you have heard of the College Football Fan Happiness Index. Have you heard of this? No? Yeah. So, it's something that ESPN invented, and it's based off of a lot of subjective and kind of objective factors, like the likelihood that your head coach will be fired, the strength of your new recruits, and your overall fans' mood on Twitter, which, very subjective. I'm not even running this. But as I was pulling up this article a few weeks ago, I see the first picture that's on there, and it's of these two UT girls in Neyland Stadium, whatever it is, just with their heads in their hands, just like completely dejected. And the subtitle, or the line underneath was great. It says, "Sadness, it's but one of the profoundly negative emotions felt by Tennessee fans this season." And so, the college football fan happiness index for UT fans was plummeting very quickly at the beginning of the season. But then, towards the end, it kind of had a little rise, 2020 Gator Bowl champions. And just like the college football fan happiness index can rise and plummet dramatically and quickly, I know that as a pastor myself, and you've probably experienced this too, the pastor happiness index does the same thing. It rises and falls just kind of like the roads you're driving around here in Boone. Based on maybe you preach a killer sermon and you get down, you're just like, that was awesome. I nailed that. And like 5 people come to faith at large group, in one night, they're like, this is awesome. And then the next morning, you're meeting with a student, and they're just like teeing you up, like asking, like, what is the gospel? And you're like, great, I went to seminary for 4 years, like, I'm even pursuing further education, I've had ministry experience, I'm ready, and you just like, whip it completely. And you just, you realize in that moment, man, what am I even doing here? What am I doing being a pastor, trying to pastor these people, and failing miserably? And you can start to entertain the lie that you're only as good as your last sermon, or you're only as good as your last meeting with a student. But Jesus in our passage is pleading with us, at least in this case, when things are going super well, to not even look at all the successes that God is giving to you, to us, but to look at how your individual name is written in heaven. He wants you to remember and to celebrate that one thing that will never change, That not just as we were talking about earlier, that God is using you in ways as he builds his church, but that you are actually part of that church, that you are a living stone that's in that church. I'll close with another UT football illustration because I appreciate that. Jeremy Pruitt, when he first became head coach, I'm about to say pastor, similar, of the UT football team. One of the first things he did is, for some reason, their 1998 championship trophy, national championship trophy, was underneath the stairs in the office of the stadium, wherever it was, and he moved that trophy from underneath the stairs to right in the center of his coaching office, so that every day he walked in, would see that trophy. And so, Rob, my one charge to you is that you would keep the trophy of your salvation with you as you're driving or walking to campus, as you are going up into the pulpit to preach at a local church or to preach on campus, or when you're meeting with a student in a coffee shop, that you would have that trophy of your salvation, knowing that regardless of how the sermon goes, regardless of how this meeting goes, this is not going to change, that Jesus has bought this trophy for me, that he has won this with his very life, death, and resurrection. And that in heaven there is a table, there's a chair with my name on it, with Rob Herron written on it, where you can go and will go forever. So that's my charge to you, brother. I'm so excited for you. I pray that you would not base your pastor happiness index on anything other than Jesus saving you. So let me just pray for you real quick. God, we just thank you for this brother. God, I'm so excited about him being here. But God, I want to celebrate today just the fact that you have called him to yourself, and that he is going to be with me, with so many people in this room, partying with you forever in heaven. We look forward to that day. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Actually, Rob, you can have a seat. So Rob asked me to charge the congregation, to encourage you all. And we joked about maybe showing a clip of Good Will Hunting. But we're not going to do that. Okay. So instead, I'm going to read just one verse from the book of Hebrews. And no one knows who wrote Hebrews, kind of a cool mystery in the Bible. But whoever it was adds this. And here it is. Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls, as those who will have to give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be no advantage to you. And so here's how I would like to encourage you guys, is this: to obey and submit. Now that sounds kind of harsh, right? Like it ruffles a little bit. Like when someone says, obey and submit to Rob. Bow down, right? Obey and submit. But you guys, like when those words are seen through the lens of the gospel, those words take on a completely different meaning and a different tone of what those words mean. Because Rob he's already obeyed and submitted himself to Jesus. And Jesus has obeyed and submitted himself to the Father's will that was redemptive. And Jesus' obedience and submission, it led him to die for those like you and me who wouldn't obey and submit. He died for people who are like turning their backs on God. He died for sinners, for us. And so when we're invited to obey and submit to our leaders in the church, it comes from a place of love and of grace and humility. And so that's where in this verse in Hebrews, where he says, or she says perhaps, they are keeping watch over our souls. That's where it fits here. That's shepherd language. You guys, Rob has been called to be our shepherd. And a shepherd watches and feeds and protects and cares for the sheep. So if I'm being cared for and loved and fed by a shepherd who loves me, why would I not submit myself to that person? Why would I not obey that person if they genuinely love me? And so that's what the writer of Hebrews is after here in chapter 13. Like, we are the sheep. And you guys, that's, I don't know if you know anything about sheep, but I think there's a specific metaphor that the Bible is going after here, and it's to remind us that we're dumb. Like we need help, and we need to be led. And so the Bible says that we're sheep, and Rob, you're a sheep too, but you're being called to also shepherd the sheep. And Jesus, obviously, is the true and better shepherd. And so my charge to you guys, my encouragement to you, is to place yourself under the graceful and watchful care of Rob. As long as Rob is submitting himself to Jesus and his gospel, then we, the sheep, will be safe. And we will feed on the gospel, and we will graze in the gospel. And so let me speak to the students specifically just for a moment. There are going to be times when Rob takes you to Our Daily Bread or E-News or the plethora of places to go eat around this place. And his call is to kind of dig around in the soil of your hearts. And he's been trained to do that, like he went to seminary, but he's been trained to do that more because he's been with Jesus. And that's what Jesus does with him and your heart. And so he's going to ask you uncomfortable questions. He's going to ask, he's going to kind of dig around in the heart. And you're going to feel like, I need to go. I've got a class. I have to go now. You know, you're gonna be tempted to kind of shut down a little bit. And let me beg you, don't do that. Let him dig around. Because the tools that he's using to dig around in your hearts and souls are grace and truth. And so let him in. Let him ask those hard questions. And I'm encouraging you guys, the students, don't hide. Is to be truthful. Whatever it is that you're wrestling with and struggling with, let him know. Because I've only known Rob for a few months, but I can already tell, like, he has a heart that is genuinely wants to help and serve and love those that God has called him to pastor and walk alongside. And Mary Lee too. And so let them know. So that's my encouragement, that's my charge to you this afternoon. So let me pray for the Lord to do that, okay? Father, thank you for this time, this special time that you have set apart to where we get to celebrate really the birth of a new pastor in a new place for him and his family. And we pray that years from now, that ASU and Boone, that this will be a sweet season for Rob and Mary Lee and Robert. And that this will be a sweet season for everyone who is under the care of Rob's ministry while he is here. We are so thankful that he is here. Thank you for bringing him here. And we pray in your name. Amen. So hey, let's stand one more time and sing one more song. And then after this